Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Our first session this afternoon will be on Unlocking Success, Best Practices in Talent Attraction and Retention Strategies in the United Arab Emirates. We're honored to have Mrs. Fatima Al Hajri from the UAE to share with us their best practices on talent attraction and retention. Her presence and expertise will undoubtedly enrich our understanding and inspire us to enhance our own strategies in this vital area. Well, before I hand the stage over to Mrs. Al Hajri, I would like to once again remind our audience to also participate in the Q&A session. You can scan the QR codes on the screen right now to submit your questions later on to Mrs. Al Hajri, and I'll bring your questions to Mrs. Al Hajri right after her presentation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Mrs. Fatima Al Hajri, Director of Investment and Talent Attraction Department, Ministry of Economy of the United Arab Emirates. Please welcome Mrs. Al Hajri.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very delighted to be joining you here today at the Global Talent Summit. But before I start, allow me to extend our thanks to the Hong Kong Labor and Welfare Bureau, as well as the Hong Kong Talent Engage team for extending this invitation, but also for their exceptional organization. Thank you so much for having us. I think we've already heard some very, very great insights from the panelists earlier this morning. A lot of them obviously gave us some insights from an academia perspective. We've also heard some insights from a private sector perspective. But I'm here today to share some public sector perspective. So what of the role of the government in talent attraction and retention? And I'll be walking you the strategy of the UAE's talent attraction and retention strategy that was formulated in 2021. But before I delve into the details of the strategy, it's important to give you some context about the UAE's unique landscape. So for those of you who are not familiar with the UAE is a federation of 7 emirates. Many of you might be familiar with Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but along with 5 other emirates, collectively they make the United Arab Emirates. Now, the United Arab Emirates did a lot of efforts in terms of diversifying its economy the past 50 years. We're relatively a young country, and we're relatively a small country. So in the past 50 years, we did so much in terms of diversifying in our economy. And we celebrated our Golden Jubilee in 2021. At that time, the government decided that we need to start planning for the next 50 years. So the government launched the projects of the 50. And what the projects of the 50 essentially is, it is a roadmap for the socio-economic development of the United Arab Emirates. Now, why do I mention this national initiative? It is because the government recognized that talent is going to be at the heart of this socio-economic plan. And the government also realized that human capital is going to be the driver of this socio-economic development plan. So what is this strategy? Again, the vision, or the overarching vision, is to establish the UAE as a top destination for global talent and to be able to drive the national knowledge economy. We have very big ambitions in terms of transitioning to a knowledge-based economy, so we need to have the talent pool to deliver on this strategy. The mission is to establish the UAE as a leader in talent competitiveness. We need to develop policies and programs that attract talent, but also be able to provide an entire ecosystem that supports the retention of this talent. So if we look at the UAE strategy, it has 2 main strategic themes. The first one being attraction, and the second one, which we think is equally important, it is the retention of talent. Now, if you take a closer look at the scope of this strategy, I don't want to bore you with the details, but I think this is a very important slide. If we look at the supply perspective and we look at the talent value chain, we see that it starts with education. Professor David mentioned it he articulated it quite well on the importance of education. And the next thing is reskilling and lifelong learning, both of which come under the cluster of development. Now, the UAE doesn't really focus on this part, and the reason being is that we sort of adopted a laissez-faire approach, and we believe that the private sector is naturally going to take care of its talent pool. And this is quite evident with the previous discussions that we heard. Instead, we're going to be focusing on attraction, and we're going to be focusing on retention. The whole idea is to augment the existing national talent pool with a very highly skilled international human capital that can accelerate this transition to a knowledge-based economy. Ideally, what we want to do is to make sure that the talent pool can accommodate our economic ambitions. So how do we do that? The idea, again, is to have 3 strategic goals. The first one is to be the top 10 globally in terms of global talent competitiveness. The second one is the strategic sectors that we've identified as the government. We need to make sure that talent is readily available to cater to the needs of these strategic sectors. And thirdly is establish the UAE as a destination for choice for global talent. Now, the third one is particularly important because when I say a global choice for talent, it is not just a place for them to work, it is a place for them to invest, it is a place for them to live. And because this is very broad in nature, we need to take into account so many different elements. We need to look into social security, we need to look into social wellness, we need to look into aspects like quality of life. And so it becomes a very holistic plan to ensure that employees are well catered for. So what we did is exactly that. We focused on a very, very broad spectrum that includes all these aspects. So for example, the UAE is actually, from an education perspective, we have around 18 curriculums. The first national Chinese curriculum outside of China is in the UAE. We noticed that there is a growing influx of Chinese into the UAE, and so we recognize the importance of having a school that can cater to the demands of these employees who are looking to relocate into the UAE. And this is just one example. The UAE is home to more than 200 nationalities, each of which, of course, has different needs and has very specific requirements. And as a very open nation, we need to make sure that it is catered for from beginning, so from preschool all the way up to retirement. We need to look at these specific needs and address them at every single stage of their life. It is not just about the employee any longer, but it's more about catering to the families of the people that are relocating to the UAE. And so this is what makes the strategy very, very holistic. Now, if we move on to the KPIs, or the ways that we monitor or assess our performance in terms of attracting talent, again, the first one being a global talent, a leader in talent competitiveness. And for the UAE, we've assigned 2031 as our year to be one of the top 10 countries. And then the second one is ensure the availability of talent in these strategic sectors. And as you can see, we're already on the 12th place as of 2023. We're only 2 rankings away from the target of 10, of the top 10. If we look at the third key goal, which is being a top destination of choice, again, the UAE is positioned as the 4th most competitive country in the world in terms of brain gain ranking. The goal is by 2023 to be among the top 3 countries. Other talent competitiveness indices where the UAE is very well positioned is INSEAD's Global Talent Competitiveness Report. It's actually the 22nd globally competitive country. We're the 3rd globally in terms of the digital skills index, the 4th in terms of brain gain index, and the 7th in terms of the ease of finding skilled employees. And then another very important index or report is the IMD Global Talent Competitiveness Report. We also rank as the 22nd competitive market. We're the 1st regionally, and we're also the 3rd in the Foreign Skills Employees Index. So where are we today and where do we stand? I think this is a particularly important time for us because we've already achieved 90% of the UAE strategy in just 3 years. And the strategy covers a lot of policy reforms and a lot of, I would say, initiatives that support the talent strategy. I don't have the time to walk through all of them, but I think 3 of them are particularly interesting to mention, which is the introduction and the modernization of the residency system. Prior to these changes, employees were tied to an employment contract, so the residency was tied to their employment contract, which typically is a 3-year term. This doesn't really give the employees a sense of belonging, and we needed to amend this social contract. And so we introduced the green visas, which is 5-year visas, as well as the 10-year visas, which are 10-year investor or high-skilled visas. Now, another important initiative to mention, and this relates to Social Security, is the introduction of a savings scheme. Prior to the introduction of this law, employees were entitled to end-of-service benefits, which is some sort of gratuity scheme. Now, this worked for a very long time, but again, we needed to amend it to sort of give employees the comfort and willingness to be in the UAE. So the savings scheme was also introduced as an alternative to the end-of-service benefits, and now actually employees can choose to save their end of service in multiple, let's say, financial investment programs. Obviously, depending on their risk appetite, they can now instead deploy this capital for, let's say, an alternative to a pension scheme. And another equally important initiative was the introduction of the unemployment law. Again, prior to that, like I said, because the residency system was tied in with the employment or with the contract, in case of termination, people had a very limited number of time to sort out things until they're no longer eligible to stay in the country. But this was completely changed with the introduction of the unemployment insurance law, and people now have the comfort of knowing that they have a 3-month insurance coverage for them. So these are just examples to show you that the kind of reforms that have been introduced, again, in a very short term, it's a 3-year time horizon. And when we talk about policy changes, I think issues that relate to social security and immigration are relatively hard to achieve. So if we compare it to developed countries, I think this is the pace at which these introductions were made and the scale at which they were made, I think is particularly interesting to note. And finally, I want to touch on more on the UAE Golden Visa. Like I said, the UAE Golden Visa is a residence that is granted to attract talents and highly skilled workers, as well as professionals, to boost foreign direct investment and to boost economic activities in areas that we've identified as priorities. Now, what is the benefit of this long-term visa? Again, it is to create and stimulate the economy. The beneficiaries of the Golden Visa include investors. They are also extended to entrepreneurs, exceptional talent, scientists and professionals, outstanding students and graduates, humanitarian pioneers, as well as frontline heroes. So the benefits, like I said, include a 10-year renewable residence. No sponsor is required for the employees. If we compare it to the previous visa, the duration to stay outside of the UAE does not basically nullify the residence. I think this is quite important when we look at the profile of any talented individual today. Mobility is very important. They want to be present in different jurisdictions around the year. So having a UAE Golden Visa really allows you to be a citizen of the world and be able to explore different jurisdictions while, of course, having the UAE's Golden Visa. So I think these are some of the few examples of the policy reforms that have been made. And the intention was to make it as holistic as possible to attract talent, but like I said, equally important to create an entire ecosystem where everyone can play their part and contribute in creating an ecosystem that can retain talent. And finally, I also want to mention that when the UAE formulated the talent strategy in it was 2021, that was post-COVID. It was a time when all governments were navigating the complexities of dealing with a pandemic. So I would say prioritizing talent at that very difficult time is a testament to the UAE's government's pursuit of excellence. It's a testament also to its focus on creating an environment that is conducive to investments and conducive to attracting talent. Another very important thing to mention as well is, for the very first time, when we started formulating the strategy, there was no benchmark. Peter mentioned it he articulated it very well. He said there was no blueprint. There is no playbook on how to formulate a talent strategy because no one does it. Obviously, there are policies, there are certain programs dedicated to do that, but we don't really have an entire strategy that looks at the human at the very center of the strategy and catering for all these needs for this particular individual. And at the same time, we needed to look at it from an economic perspective. It has always been looked at from a security perspective and an immigration perspective. When we speak about foreigners or expats, that's the lens that typically governments adopt. And we really wanted to have a new set of let's say, a new lens to look at this, to look at talent and talent mobility. And by adopting an economic perspective, we can mobilize all the different stakeholders to actually contribute in materializing this very strategy. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share the example of the UAE and say that now we've achieved 90% of the strategy in less than 3 years. We are proactively working to realize the remaining part of the strategy. But because the talent landscape continues to change, we also want to remain agile and dynamic and make sure that we take into account all the different factors that continue to influence people's consideration when they look at relocating. So we are now actually looking to review the strategy, align obviously with our economic priorities, but also learn from experiences and platforms such as the Global Talent Summit. So thank you so much once again for extending this invite, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Al Hajri. Please remain on stage. Thank you for the informative presentation that really shared a lot with us about the strategies and very comprehensive initiatives that you have at the UAE for talent attraction and retention. So we have actually received several questions from our audience. If you don't mind, we'll start with the first question here. So the first question is, how does the UAE government collaborate with businesses to ensure effective talent attraction and retention strategies are in place?
Thank you so much. I think that's a great question. Like I said, because the strategy is very holistic in nature, we obviously recognize the importance of engaging with the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think one area that has been a particular success for us is our collaboration with LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. So through this collaboration, we've been able to get very valuable insights on the talent profile. What does the talent profile look like in the UAE? What does the digital skills profile look like in the UAE? Where are we seeing some trends like talent migration, both inward and outward? So all of these insights really help the government in terms of understanding the landscape in real time. Instead of just having to wait for labor statistics or whatnot. Obviously, this is valuable, but it is complementary to what is being provided. So I think collaborating with the business from this perspective and leveraging on technology has been particularly important and interesting.
Right, that it's the use of data analytics and also big data and also insights from LinkedIn, which is a great platform as well, one of our partners at the summit. Okay, thank you. And the next question is, how does the UAE government ensure diversity and inclusion in its talent attraction and retention policies?
Like I said, the UAE is home to more than 200 nationalities. And I think the idea of inclusiveness and openness is really part of the ethos of the UAE government. It's something that our forefathers really embedded in the UAE society and really sort of cascades down to all institutions. I think the example of having different curriculums is a great example of that. Because you're really trying to cater to that need instead of, having them deal with the reality of having just an American or a British or an IB system. Right. It's more of understanding what this community needs and providing them with what they need.
I find it really encouraging as well as a Chinese to have a curriculum there in UAE available for Chinese people relocating or relocated to the UAE. And it's always good to have the government actually setting a great example for businesses to follow when it comes to inclusion. Thank you very much for answering to that. And we have one more question from our audience that asks, how does the UAE government measure the effectiveness of your talent attraction and retention policies?
Well, I think I demonstrated the KPIs. Obviously, from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, that is sort of what we try to gauge and measure. So we have very clear KPIs to measure our ability to attract and retain talent. But obviously, we also have different methods. We, again, going back to our point of collaborating with businesses, we work very closely with other partners that help support us in terms of surveys. So understanding the sentiment of the business community, because maybe the official statistics are very nice and fluffy, but if we get a closer understanding of what the business is experiencing, it may reflect something else. So we always try to make sure that we have a very comprehensive input when it comes to formulating the strategy, but also monitoring and evaluating it. So I would say, surveys along with our KPIs.
Right, the surveys and the KPIs, and that will also help you to do regular reviews on the initiatives and strategies that you're having at UAE.
Exactly.
All right, thank you very much today, Mrs. Al Hajri. I'm afraid we have only this much time for all the questions that we have. Thank you so much for the presentation today. Let's give a big round of applause to Mrs. Al Hajri for the presentation. Thank you so much.